Since 2018, sports betting has become legal in more than 40 states in America. And now it seems like sports betting is everywhere, on billboards, on cable TV, at every sports venue. Everything is sponsored by a gambling company, and it raises the question, should we do something about this? Is this good for society? Isaac Rose Berman is a professional gambler and a gambling policy analyst, and he joins the podcast today to talk about the rise of sports betting, about how it happened, whether or not it's good, what impact it might be having on populations like young men, and ultimately, what we should do about it, if anything. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to drop a like, a subscribe, leave a comment, tell us how you feel, recommend us to a friend, all of that is always appreciated. If you want to really support the podcast, the best way to do that is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can join a local chapter, get involved in your city's politics. You can join our private Slack, where members of the community discuss the issues of the day. You can become a member and get access to our Sticker of the Month Club, get access to bonus episodes of the podcast. There's many benefits, and it helps keep the podcast going. It helps the work that we do. If you want to become a member, you can do so at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest this episode is Isaac Rose Berman. Isaac, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
All right, so today we're talking about sports gambling and gambling more generally in society. We've seen an explosion, it feels like, of the popularity of gambling. And so I kind of just want to take stock of where we are before we get into any questions about like policy or what we should be doing. Where are we? Like, what used to be the state of sports gambling in the U.S. legally and culturally, and when did it change and where is it now?
Sure. So I think sort of more broadly, a lot of this is due to the internet. Right. In the past, if you wanted to bet on sports, you had to go to a physical casino. In the U.S., that was only legal in Nevada. And then in 2018, the Supreme Court decided that states were allowed to legalize sports betting themselves. And so we saw this cascade where today, 39 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized sports betting, almost all, I believe, on your phones. And so when we think about the rise of sports betting, you know, it's mostly people betting on their phone, and sort of the same goes for things like meme stocks or cryptocurrency. A lot of it is really intertwined with the fact that we spend our lives on the internet and on our phones.
Do we have any kind of idea of like what the volume of the sports betting industry was kind of before this big wave of legalization that happened? Because, you know, today it would be very easy just to like get a report from DraftKings or where all these different companies and kind of get a sense of like how big of this all is. But back then, you know, it was more like you said, you'd have to either go to Vegas or go to like Atlantic City in New Jersey or like have some local bookie. Do we have a sense of like how big it used to be and how much it's grown in the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is not really. As you mentioned, you know, the ways people generally used to bet on sports were not regulated. Your local bookie or your offshore website is not reporting their net revenues to the IRS. And so there are some estimates out there, but a lot of them are really inflated because you can imagine the people who are talking about the size of that market are often the legal regulated industry who's really incentivized to make it seem a lot bigger than it is, so that they can tell policymakers, look, by not legalizing this and expanding this, you're losing all of this potential tax revenue. And so that was really one of the biggest cases to legalize gambling, was, casinos went to states and they said, look, you're losing so much money. If you regulate this, you're not actually going to increase the number of people gambling. You're just going to bring them into the regulated market, which is going to generate all of this tax revenue. We're going to be able to protect people better than they were on sort of the black market. And obviously that's not the case. People are gambling a lot more than they were in the past, because when you legalize things and you sort of normalize it, whether it's gambling or marijuana or any sort of other vice, when you normalize it, a lot more people end up doing it. But so to answer your question, the answer is no, we don't have a great idea. And a lot of that gambling still takes place on unregulated bookmakers.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that I have that all of this is way, way bigger than it used to be. And I don't have, like you said, I was not able to find like hard statistics on this, but I'm somebody who was sports betting 15 years ago during college. It's a story I sometimes tell on this podcast that like I was in college and graduate school, I was kind of like a semi-professional gambler with both poker, online poker, and certain kinds of sports betting. And I remember like having to like, the sports betting websites were all like very sketchy in terms of how you had to move money in and out of them. And they were all offshore, weird Caribbean websites. And like, you had to do certain tricks to get like money onto a European site. And it was all just very sketchy. And like, you could tell this was not something that most people thought about. And today it just culturally, it feels like it's everywhere. You can't watch a sporting event without, the whole thing is sponsored by DraftKings or FanDuel or, some other gambling site. And they're actually like official partners of all the leagues now. And you turn on ESPN and they're actually talking about like, this segment of ESPN is sponsored by such and such. And it feels like it's everywhere.
No, you're exactly right. And I think you touched on a big point there, which is the friction involved. Obviously there's a percentage of the population that's always going to want to bet on sports, but the difference between having to convert your money into Bitcoin and use a sort of weird, sketchy offshore bookie versus being able to download DraftKings on your phone and deposit with Venmo is a really big difference. And once again, just having access to that 24/7 on your phone, it's allowed for really anybody to do that. You look at some of the stats. There was a recent study that came out. I think it's almost 50% of American men between the ages of 18 and 44 have placed at least one bet on sports in the last few years. And so, I don't know, we don't have great data on how much people were gambling before, but surely it was not that high.
Yeah, and just I don't know. It's before we get into the policy stuff, I want to ask you this because we're going to talk policy. We're going to talk about, the actual hard level economic impacts. Is this having a negative impact on society? Is it having a negative impact on young men in particular? I want to get into that and the more serious stuff, but there's a less serious thing that I think is at least worth addressing, and that is just, is this bad from a vibe standpoint? Like a lot of people feel like, oh, I can't watch sports anymore without like it being all about sports betting. And it just ruins the vibes. Do you think that number one, I guess, do you feel that? And number two, do you think that has any weight?
Oh, completely. I completely agree with it. Even as someone who bets on sports a lot, it's frustrating to not be able to watch a game and see the commentary, not only because of the frequency, but because a lot of it is just so brain dead. You're seeing the same ads over and over again, pushing these things. But I think there is, people are really upset. And that is very legitimate, not only for themselves. I think a lot of it centers around kids and the idea that sports is kind of this pure activity. I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to baseball games with my dad, and I was a big baseball fan and we would enjoy them. And now that experience would be clouded with the fact that there's a DraftKings ad in the back of the stadium. And if we're listening to the announcers, they'd be talking about the spread. So it is sort of a big deal. And I think for a lot of people, it's, look, okay, fine, gambling should be legal. You should be allowed to do it, but just don't shove it in my face all the time. Which is why I think, we're going to get into policy later. But I think down the road, what you're going to end up seeing is something like a dedicated gambling network, because I just don't think it's really feasible that you're going to be allowed to, in 5 years, advertise gambling on networks where a large percentage of the listeners are you're not going to be able to advertise gambling on networks where a large percentage of the viewership are minors.
Interesting. That's parallel to kind of how cigarette advertising was eventually banned
Exactly.
almost everywhere because you can't advertise cigarettes, I think, anywhere that children might read, which is most places. So, outside of a few places maybe that, um, but that's a policy parallel we might get into. And yeah, it makes me feel like kind of an old man, like, and I recognize that to be like, well, it was much better in my day when you could go to the baseball park and not have to see a DraftKings. And like, yeah, like that's an old man complaint. I get it, but like, not every old man complaint is wrong. So I don't know. Maybe this one has some merit to it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think even among sports bettors, people sort of agree with that. It's just frustrating to see it just everywhere all the time.
Agreed. Yeah, but it's not just the vibes that have been ruined here. If it was just, bad vibes, they've made the park look tacky. Like if it was just that, we wouldn't be sitting down here. But instead, it feels like there have been other more serious kind of societal implications for this rise in sports betting. You threw out a stat that said like half of younger aged men have bet on sports recently. What impact has that had on society?
So I think it's important to contextualize this among all gambling. And so actually, even though those ads are everywhere, compared to other types of gambling, sports betting is still relatively small. So just to throw a stat at you, Americans lost 3 times as much to the lottery that they did to legal regulated sports books last year. And the lottery is much more regressive, and yeah, the effects are much more concentrated in areas and among populations that are at much greater risk. So even though this is kind of bad and that people are losing money, the salience is much higher because we're just seeing a lot of it. And if you look at places like Las Vegas, only 3 or 4% of their revenue from the casinos actually comes from sports betting. So it is actually, in terms of people losing money, it is bad. And we can get into sort of some of the research that suggests the impacts of what's happening to people. But relative to other kinds of gambling, it's actually not the biggest one.
It's an interesting point because I mean, there are a lot of other people who will say like the lottery is bad, and we should crack down on that.
I think that's probably true, but that's a different conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a debate that we're going to get into. It's a similar debate of like if people want to spend money irresponsibly in ways that might really, really negatively impact their life. Should we let them, or should the state step in and say like, no, you are not allowed to handle your own money this way? It's kind of a freedom versus outcomes kind of debate in some sense, but it is interesting to think that about the lottery. And you go to Vegas, most of the money is made on slots. Like the least sexy form of gambling is slots, but that's the moneymaker. But at the same time, I think that what's interesting about sports betting and kind of a range of other activities is that it's new and it's growing. Like sports betting is growing a lot faster than playing the lottery is. It's growing faster than the slots. It's a new thing that's exploded. It continues to kind of trend upwards. And you could even correlate, the ability to get DraftKings on your smartphone with, the ability to get Robinhood on your smartphone and like start day trading GameStop, and AMC and Tesla and putting, options on Tesla. And you could talk about the rise of crypto meme coins that, there are people out there throwing irresponsible amounts of money into like, whatever the latest, tariff coin, poop coin, Doge coin, I don't know, like whatever they might be. All of this is like really, really explosively growing. And I think we kind of need to figure out what's happening in terms of like, is this having a negative effect on society?
Well, I think it probably is, both culturally, and if you look at, what is gambling? Gambling is people risking money trying to win more money. But as we all know, in the long run, the house wins. So when you look at the expansion of gambling, whether it's via crypto or via sports betting or via online casino, which is to be clear, what all of these companies want to be. DraftKings does not want to be a sports book. They want to be an online casino, and that's not legal in most states. But in places like Michigan, where both are legal, a vast majority of their revenue comes from online casino, not sports betting. But, the underpinning all of that is people lose money. And you can talk about, okay, well, there are states getting tax revenue and there are jobs being created, but that's all because people are losing, and those losses are often very concentrated. And so there's a percentage of the population, exact numbers vary. A lot of people will say around 1% to 2% of the population that's addicted, and they're going to lose, devastating amounts of money. And not only that, but obviously their lives and their family and their friends are going to be devastated by that as well. But then there are a lot of other people who are impacted in less severe ways. Jonathan Cohen just came out with a book about the rise of sports betting called Losing Big. And what he talks a lot about is sort of the stunted financial growth of a lot of young men due to sports betting, people who are not addicted. They're, still able to pay rent, but the money that they otherwise would have saved or invested is now being lost to DraftKings or FanDuel. And when you look at the research, there is research now that is showing that in states that legalize sports betting, people are investing less. I think it's for every dollar that they spend on sports books, that's $2 less that they're investing or saving. And that is bad. There's also, of course, the substitution effects, where if people are giving their money to DraftKings or FanDuel, they're not going out to eat, they're not going to movies, doing other things that are generally considered to be more economically productive. But there's a lot of people who are losing a lot of money. And there might be some good things coming of that. Maybe they're getting some entertainment, but it's hard to see how this is good from a financial standpoint. And I can steel man that case if you'd like, but I don't think it's that strong.
Well, I mean, we'll get into that in a second, but one of the things that strikes me as I think more about kind of the distinction between these new kinds of gambling, sports gambling being kind of the biggest one probably, but also day trading, also crypto coins and trading on meme coins. It strikes me that these are almost a little bit more seductive in the way that like slots or the lottery is not, because it really is true that some people can win at this kind of stuff. And I know you have a long history as a pretty successful sports bettor. You are not, an anti-betting kind of crusader. You and I have both lived in this world. We've both been profitable gamblers in the past, but we are very much the exception. And it's that tantalizing kind of like, well, some people can do day trading. Some rare individuals can day trade stocks and actually make money. And typically they work for hedge funds and make a lot more money than you and I do. Some people can be successful sports bettors. And knowing that is true is just like, the allure of that is very, very strong. Whereas, with, playing the slots, playing the lottery, whatever, like everybody knows, even the people who waste a ton of money on it, you're never actually going to beat the slots. Like it's a whole thing. But I don't know. It strikes me that is like, the seductive power of it is that maybe you could be one of the ones that's actually a winner.
So it's a really interesting point. And I honestly go back and forth because, yes, obviously, the percentage of people who bet on sports and think that they can win or that they will be long-term winners is much higher than that percentage of people playing at the slots. But it's not actually clear in the data, and I think even anecdotally, that translates to more dangerous outcomes. You're saying slots are less dangerous than sports. I think the opposite is true. And historically, the reason that sports betting...
I don't want to say that they're less dangerous, but I just think that like there's a certain allure that like with slots, you talk to people who actually are like addicted to playing slots and they know they're going to lose the money. They just go and do it anyway. Like it.
Yeah,
There's some stories where they're actually like, they get upset when they win and they're only happy when they get a big win and then they spend it all back down. But the thing about like gambling, like sports gambling, I feel like draws in new people because it is, because they think they might be able to win.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the reality is we don't really know the extent to which that impacts people's gambling behaviors. That's one of the topics that we're studying is trying to understand exactly why people behave the way that they do, particularly when it comes to people who are doing dangerous things. But I think it's also important to understand that sports betting is not this static activity. And so in the literature, sports betting has always been considered to be much lower risk than other types of gambling, even though it has this sort of skill-based allure of it that you mentioned. And it's generally because it's slow and not manipulatable. So for example, you bet on a Yankees game, that's going to give you entertainment for 3 hours. Whereas if you play slots, it's every second. And so you're going to end up betting a lot more. And also, you're betting on a real world outcome where the casino can't manipulate it and make it more addictive. Whereas with slots, you talk about slot design. I mean, these machines are literally made to be as addictive as possible. Things like virtual real mapping, where they change the number of symbols. So let's say, you need 3 sevens in a row. And on the first reel, there'll be 10 sevens. On the second reel, there'll be 8 sevens. And on the third wheel, there'll be only 1 7. So you kind of often will get an artificially high number of near misses. And, the patent applications for these products literally say, we want to design a product that is as addictive as possible because or they don't say as addictive as possible, but they'll say, we want to design a product that is difficult to tell what the true odds are. But in recent years, especially in the last couple of years, that's changed. Sports betting is now no longer slow. People aren't only betting on the Yankees to win, but whether the next pitch is going to be a ball or a strike. And it's also not, it is manipulable in that these companies are able to offer so many types of bets that they weren't able to before. So you're doing this in a way that is much more dangerous than in the past. And so in terms of the research that we're doing at AIBM, we're really trying to understand the products themselves and not just looking at, okay, sports betting big picture, but how are these actual products changing in a way that's really more addictive and more dangerous for a lot of people, similar to, social media, in that you can't just say social media is bad or dangerous because TikTok is not the same as Tumblr from 10 years ago.
It's interesting you talk about the newness of the product itself, that it's not just, oh, I'm just betting on the Yankees to win on Saturday. That you've got in-game betting, you've got over-unders, you've got all these player props, you've got real-time betting. And one of the things I think about is that I think even people who might have a little bit of talent at this, or people who might think they might be a good bettor, tend not to realize how far the deck is going to be stacked against them. That, this is something I talked about with Nate Silver when he was on the podcast, that it's a pain in the ass to actually be a winning gambler, even if you are one of the 1% of sports bettors who can actually do this and make a profit. The casinos will figure that out. The apps will figure it out. They are very data rich and they have a lot of data scientists, and they will immediately cut you off. They'll all of a sudden say, oh, we used to let you bet $1,000 a game. Now we're going to let you bet $10 a game. Good luck being a winning gambler. We're so proud of you,
No, it's exactly right. And more than that, they'll also sort of push the most high margin products. So you mentioned a few, but things like parlays and same game parlays, if you open up your DraftKings or FanDuel app, you're not going to be shown a bet on the Yankees to win. You're going to be encouraged to bet on, the Yankees to win and Aaron Judge to hit a home run and this guy to have 8 strikeouts, bets which have an incredibly high house edge that's very, very difficult to calculate, especially for someone who, might not be super knowledgeable about these products.
And the other thing they can do, they kind of do negative targeting, which is, they don't want to offer any good bets to people they believe are sharp bettors being a profitable, a strong bettor. They're just going to stop offering you, or they're going to push your limit down to where it's a couple dollars. But if you are potentially a problem gambler or a big loser, however you want to say it, you're a guy who loses all sorts of money, they are going to constantly be pinging you with like, hey, here's a new bet. Hey, have you seen this? Hey, come back and play. We'll give you a little bonus offer. They know who the suckers are, and they very much are trying to exploit them for all they're worth.
No, you're exactly right. And I think that's why in a lot of ways this is more dangerous than other vices. You go to the liquor store and you buy liquor, but they don't have, your phone number. Usually they're not able to send you push notifications. They don't know exactly what you want all of the time. And they're not going to be able to send you, 50% off your next order if you come back. Maybe they are actually, I don't know, but probably not. And I don't think people realize the extent to which they're able to target. I mean, I know people who are even on a sport by sport basis. They're not allowed to bet more than a couple dollars on one sport, but they're able to bet, multiple times what a standard person could on another sport because the sports books know not that this person is necessarily an overall winner or loser, but hey, they're pretty good at this sport, but they're bad at this sport. So we're not going to allow them to bet on the thing that they're good at, but we're really going to encourage them to bet on the thing that we know they're bad at. And not only when it comes to sports, but also for sort of cross-selling from sports to casino. So there'll be a lot of people who, maybe aren't even allowed to bet on sports at all, but the casino knows they obviously are not going to have any edge when it comes to the casino. So they'll still get targeted offers for things like, a deposit match in the casino because they know they might go dump it all off at blackjack. These are technology companies. They know almost everything about their users, and they're able to use that to prey on people.
So the scenario we're in is that this sports gambling, and especially kind of mobile sports gambling and mobile casinos from your phone, has exploded over the last 5 to 10 years. It's been legalized in a large number of states. It's not every single state in the country, but it's most of them at this point. And so we've seen an explosion of this kind of thing, along with some other related behaviors like the stock market, Robinhood and trading crypto. And I'm going to read off a couple studies that you mentioned earlier, that some statistic about that for every dollar that they spend on sports betting, there's like $2 that they don't put into a retirement account. And there have been a couple studies that have shown some worrying stuff like that people who end up on these sites, it tend to have higher credit card balances afterwards, lower access to credit. They have a reduced ability to invest. They invest less money. And that
higher rates of domestic violence.
Increased rates of domestic violence. That's one I haven't even seen, but I see one that says, bankrupt in states that implement that legalize sports betting, bankruptcies increased by 28%. And they also saw an increase in the amount of debt collection and auto loan delinquencies and things like that. And it really seems like we are actually starting to see, because they have a very clever design in how they did this, because the states all legalized sports betting, not all at the same time. They did it on different dates. So you can almost, track, this state did it on this day, this state did it a year later, and see, as they legalize sports betting, do all these bad things happen. And it certainly seems like they're having a lot of negative outcomes.
Yeah, I think you're referring to some research out of California from some professors at UCLA and USC. We actually have a write-up of that study on the AIBM site. But yeah, no, you mentioned it's a great study because they exploit the varied rollout to really understand, okay, what happens when sports betting gets introduced. And yeah, it's not good.
So if we agree that kind of, number one, this activity has increased a lot and the vibes around it are bad, and more than just the vibes being bad, it sure seems like there's evidence this is harming people. The question then becomes, what do you do about it? And there's a number of pathways we could kind of go down here as a society. We could do nothing and just, the very libertarian response would be, I'm a libertarian. I don't care if it hurts people. They should be free to do whatever they want to do. If they get hurt, that's their own business. And that's, it's something we could do. But I think for most people, that will be somewhat unsatisfying, and if you believe that, you believe that. There's no arguing you out of it. But I think most people kind of would feel in their gut that something a little bit more than that should be done. There are a few things happening, like some of the sports betting platforms have formed like a responsible online gaming association, and they're committing millions of dollars to fund research and education. Do you think that kind of thing can have any impact? This kind of, voluntary association to kind of police themselves?
So I'm not super optimistic about that specifically. I don't think it's great when corporations are allowed to regulate themselves. And more generally, I'm have relatively libertarian inclinations, right? I think people should be free to do what they want to do. And I think it's important on this issue to realize that we have frameworks that we can apply. This is not that different from alcohol or from tobacco. And we as a society have said, okay, look, you should be allowed to drink alcohol. You should be allowed to smoke cigarettes. That doesn't make you a bad person, but there should be some restrictions. There should be some restrictions on advertising. There should be some restrictions on the types of products you're allowed to offer, right? You can't just offer a new drug without going through FDA approval. You can't just put things on the shelves for Americans without going through sort of a regulatory process. And so we just need to think about ways that we can use regulation to protect the public from these sort of predatory practices. When it comes to self-regulation,
well, and that's an interesting thing because the things you're talking about are very like physical, real world, like food that we eat, drugs that we put into our body, whether it's, legal drugs like Ozempic or whether it's, weed, whether it's a physical product you buy at the store. Those are all very like in real life meat space, kind of like things you have to touch and feel with your body. And we do have a lot of regulation in society around that stuff, but it feels like society is just kind of walked into the idea that like, well, digital stuff is different. Websites are different, apps are different, and they don't seem to have there doesn't seem to be as much of a default towards like, we've got to regulate this. I think that's part of what's happening here is that because it's all just happening on your phone in an app, there's less of a push to regulate it because we just kind of assume for whatever reason, like that's, the default is that we don't regulate that stuff as much.
No, you're 100% correct. But just because we haven't done it in the past doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it in the future. And I think it's not just sports, but things like social media and porn, things that clearly are having bad effects, if not on, all of society writ large, then at least on a small percentage of people who are being really impacted by them. I mean, sports betting, or not sports betting, but gambling is in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual as the only, recognized behavioral addiction. So it's not something like the idea of regulating this or the idea that this is similar to alcoholism or drugs isn't like this pie in the sky idea. But yeah, thinking about how to regulate things that are on our phones and computers as opposed to that are in the real world is something that we as a society have to grapple with. And yeah, I'm not sure I have, the perfect answers, but it's a really hard question, an important question.
Well, so let's talk about that because like I said, I think there's three main approaches here. Number one is to just go laissez-faire. We just accept that some people will be hurt by it. And if you're an intellectually honest libertarian, you would say, look, maybe people will be hurt, but that's their business. And I'm willing to accept that because freedom is paramount. And that's a point of view.
But I want to push back on that quickly because I think that even if you are particularly libertarian, you can believe that people should be free to do things, but not believe that companies should be free to prey on people in a way that, look, you can say you should be allowed to sign up and bet on sports, but sports books should not be allowed to micro-target the people they deem to be particularly at risk of addiction to try to extract as much money as possible. So I just want to make a little bit of a distinction there. I understand your point, but I think it's not totally fair.
I mean, it depends how libertarian you are, I guess, how far down that road you want to go. But it's that kind of approach or something in that area is one thing we could do. A second thing we could do is we could just kind of go back to prohibition, essentially, and say, well, we've legalized sports gambling in a lot of these places. We should just undo that. It should just become illegal again. And again, maybe that's a point of view. Maybe you think the harms are not worth it, and we should just have a bigger nanny state. And you don't care if people call it the nanny state. You're fine. It should just be. And the third path, which I'm personally interested in trying to figure out the details of, is something in between, where like I would kind of give the analogy here to like legalizing weed, where weed is now legal in a lot of places in America, but it's not the case that you can just walk into Walmart and buy like 30 pounds of marijuana, right? That's not how we've structured it. It's in many places a little bit of a pain in the ass to go buy weed. You've got to go to some specialty shop, and it's probably weird. The guys behind the counter are a little odd. And I don't know, like there's this potential middle ground of like it's legal, but it's kind of a pain in the ass to do it. Like we put a lot of frictions into the market so that it's not as seamless as download DraftKings and within 30 seconds you're connected to your bank account and you're betting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I will say it's a bit funny that, we're both based in New York, and New York's weed rollout has gone particularly poorly. But yeah, I think that middle ground where this is an activity that's legal, it's regulated, but it's a little bit harder, it's a little bit less normalized. You're not seeing ads for it on TV. LeBron James isn't telling you to sign up to DraftKings with his promo code. I think that's clearly the right way to do it, but how to get there is tricky, and it's made trickier by the fact that this is totally state by state, and that all states have their own regulatory bodies and rules for how these products should be operated, which is why I probably think you need some level of federal involvement, whether that's setting, minimum guidelines for what's acceptable, or even things like funding research. Right now, I believe the federal government has $0 allocated to gambling disorder or problem gambling research, which is kind of ridiculous. A lot of states don't have any funding for people for treatment. So you need some level of probably federal involvement to make sure that states are at least doing something.
So here's an idea that I want to throw at you and just see whether or not you think this would be a good idea or not. Because it's something, like I said, I'm playing around with these ideas. Should we ban smartphone gambling? Like, part of me thinks that, again, the smartphone is the problem in this instance, that if you have the ability to just open an app and within 15 seconds you are gambling on all sorts of wild parlays and options and all sorts of stuff like that, that is really just too frictionless and too easy. And part of me thinks, well, maybe everybody should be able to gamble. We should legalize it, but you should like have to go to a place. You should have to go to a weird little store where it smells bad and there's a weird guy speaking Russian behind the counter, and you've got to go place your bet with him. And then, the fine, you can gamble, but like it should not be as seamless as it is now. And the smartphone is what enables that. And so maybe a solution, just throwing one out there, is that we should ban smartphone gambling specifically.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, now you're really getting into crank territory, right? I think the difficulty with a lot of this is that at the same time that the advancements in sports betting have made these products more addictive and more dangerous, they've also made them a lot more enjoyable. So, there's a huge percentage of the population that bets on sports that the experience for them is now a lot better, and the ability to just open their phone and place a bet is super convenient. It's hard for me to say whether it's a net good or bad, because to do that, you basically have to say, okay, how much value in terms of entertainment and quality of life are this larger segment of the population getting versus the people who are being harmed by it. I kind of agree with you in that it's probably better for society if that was the case, if there was a lot more frictions involved. But from a regulatory standpoint, that's really hard. I had an idea recently, which is sort of even more ridiculous, which is like, a gambling specific phone, right? So you imagine you can still do all of that stuff, but it's a phone that you leave, on your living room couch. So when you go at night from 7 to 9 p.m. to watch sports, you can look at it and place bets on it. But you can't just go 24/7, when you're at work, constantly checking your bets and the push notifications. But yeah, these are kind of Luddite ideas, which doesn't necessarily make them bad, but it's tricky. And I think one thing that's important here, which I didn't mention, is there should be more funding for research, because the reality is we don't know what works, whether it's responsible gambling messaging to encourage people to be safer, or policies that actually combat addiction, both in terms of treatment and from a preventative nature. We really don't know. I was thinking, in the past, one idea that I had was that, okay, every time you log into your gambling app, you should be forced to see exactly how much money you're down. And a lot of the times these apps make it kind of tricky to see that. And the idea being, okay, if every time I log into DraftKings, it says I'm down $500 for the month, $700 for the last 2 months, whatever, that would make me less likely to do it. But the problem actually is that there's been some research on this, and that has the unintended consequence of making people then chase those losses to get back to even because they're confronted with it.
People chase the losses.
Yeah, and so the reality is
That's funny, man.
I don't know, which is why I'm really excited to be doing this research at AIBM, and I think we need a lot more funding for that, so we know what actually does work. Because I can give you 100 different ideas on what might work, but I don't really know.
I really like that idea, actually. And I wonder if it would be better if it wasn't like monthly. Because look, month to month, you can have winning months and losing months.
Totally.
Even just as a bad gambler, there's sometimes a limit to how bad you can be at sports betting, because even as long as you're not betting exotic stuff, you're usually about 45% to win, even in the worst case scenario. If you're just betting straight, the Yankees win versus Yankees lose, those are normally pretty close to 50-50 bets.
Yep, you're losing about 5%.
If they did the same thing for like lifetime, though, every time you log in, you see I'm down $8,000 lifetime to DraftKings.
Yeah.
And that next month I'm down $8,500 lifetime. Like, just that feels like it would, number one, bigger number, bigger kick in the gut. That feels like it might work. I don't know.
What about stuff? Are you in favor of showing calories on menus? There's some conflicting research there about whether that works. I think another one is, people make fun of messaging on cigarette cartons, but there is research that works. If people smoke less cigarettes because you have these images of cancer on it. I will say, as someone who enjoys the occasional cigarette, it's kind of crappy for me, but these things work. So, denormalizing it is a big thing, but how exactly that works.
Have you seen like the Australian ones? The ones in Australia are so like hardcore. Like the box of cigarettes says like,
oh God, no, I haven't.
I'm going off memory here, but there's like cigarette cartons in Australia where it literally just says, "These will kill you. You will die," like in big block letters.
Is it bad that's almost like that? I almost think that's kind of cool in a way. It's pretty bad, but
they've got some like hardcore pictures of like people who have like their lower jaw removed because they've like,
it's horrible.
But no, I mean again. This is all philosophical in a sense where it's not like other types of economic policy. If we talk about like, I don't know, tariff policy or minimum wage policy, to some extent you're talking about your values, but a lot of it is very just empirical. It's just, what should we set the minimum wage at? Well, there's going to be some level where it doesn't impact employment enough, and like you can just look at the things that it's doing empirically. You can measure it. You can look at the research, and you can come to more or less a correct conclusion. With this, it's like, well, we know it's probably having a bad effect, and then we just kind of have to weigh two different values against each other. The value of freedom, and that people should be able to do what they want, which I mostly think is a good thing. We shouldn't have too much of a nanny state to stop people from hurting themselves. If they want to eat lots of red meat and drink a lot and smoke, like that's you're allowed to do that. But then the other part where like society might be better off if we do restrict this. Like we know that if by legalizing this stuff that, people are not investing, they're not saving for the future, their bankruptcies are going up, their credit scores are going down. Like, I don't know. To me, that's just a complicated philosophical question of how much should you intervene in people's lives.
No, it's a really tricky question. I think it's probably more similar to stuff that, like from a consumer finance perspective. So obviously the CFPB kind of getting gutted right now, but I think, the most similar regulations are to stuff like payday loans, where, most reasonable people, I think, would say that even if you have a bad credit score, you probably should be able to get access to some money, but payday lenders should not be able to charge absolutely obscene rates and totally rip people off. So I think it's probably more analogous to that kind of policy than, what exactly should the minimum wage be set at. And I kind of don't like this framework, not to call you out here, but the idea that it has to be, either we do something or we just let it be free. I think it should be free, but there should be restrictions on these companies and the policies that they have, and ensuring that American customers and consumers are protected.
I mean, I guess I'm just saying that I try to be as intellectually honest as I can, where, if my proposal was like, well, we should legalize sports betting, but you have to do it on your own special phone, or you have to go do it in person. Like, I recognize that makes people less free in a meaningful
Totally.
way. That is an imposition on their lives. But I would just maybe, if I'm advocating for that, I would say, even though it makes you less free, I still think it's a good idea. In the same way that, like, if I was going to advocate for gun control, like, this is like an imposition on legal gun owners, but I still think it's a good idea, that the pros outweigh the cons.
Yeah, so I think there are places where I draw the line. So I mentioned this before, but I'm really against online casino and the legalization of online casino. So I think that you should be allowed to bet on sports legally in a regulated way, but that you shouldn't be able to play slots or blackjack. And it's partly philosophical, but more so just we see the impacts. It's much more addictive. People lose a lot more money. You can chase your losses, and the consequences are a lot worse. So I think there are some places where I draw the line. I'm not totally sure where I do with sports betting. Yeah, I don't really know.
And you also see, by the way, with online casinos, that, like, also a pretty heavily young male thing. Most of the things that we're talking about, as is indicated by your association with the American Institute for Boys and Men. And we love Richard Reeves here. I love the work that he does. And that,
Yes, I'll give a shout out to your podcast episode with him. One of my favorite podcast episodes.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
everybody should go check out the one with my boss before they listen to me.
Well, I was just going to point out that all this stuff, whether it's sports betting, whether it's online casinos, crypto trading, meme stocks, these are all, like, heavily male things. This is mostly young men engaging in these behaviors. It's mostly not older men in their 50s and 60s, maybe a little bit. And it's mostly not women. And I hope that I don't get any, angry women listening who say I can also be addicted to sports gambling, but just, like, statistically, they're not very much.
Well, actually, sports betting, yes, but online casino actually, and casino in general, is a lot more split than you might think, which is why a lot of these companies are so keen to move into the online casino world, because there's a much larger customer base. Most of them, you're right, very male dominated, but you'd be surprised that the people pulling the online slot levers, it's pretty split.
It's interesting because that's something I've never understood very well. Like, I don't understand the person who would go play slots in the casino in general, but I definitely don't understand the person who plays slots online. That baffles me.
What about the person who plays Candy Crush?
Yeah, I guess it is just a form of Candy Crush for money. But the thing that really, really gets me, even beyond that, is, there's a website called kick.com, which is like a competitor to Twitch. It's a live streaming site, and I'm sure you're aware of it. But for the listeners, it's a live streaming site. And the thing is, kick.com loses an enormous amount of money. It is not a profitable business, except for the fact that it is owned by Stake. And Stake is an online gambling company that is essentially online casinos. And they basically pay a lot of the streamers on Kick to just play slots, like, on air or on stream, I guess. And some of these people have, like, 80,000-90,000 people watching them play slots at a time, and they're
it's horrible. And a lot of those viewers are children. And to go, not to go too down the rabbit hole there, but oftentimes not only is the money that they're playing with fake, but they're getting paid massive amounts of money. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of dollars a month to stream this to a largely underage audience. And also, they'll often get paid by, getting a reimbursement for the losses of the people who will use their affiliate codes. So it's like, sign up with my code, and for every dollar you lose, that streamer will then get 25 cents. Totally separate topic, but yeah, that stuff is crazy. When you talk about underage gambling, it's actually a huge issue, especially for boys, and mainly not sports betting, but things like stake or loot boxes, video games, skin gambling, all of this stuff. It's a big problem.
Oh man, that is another That is another thing. I hadn't even connected the dots to like video game loot boxes, but there's a whole ecosystem and a thriving market for like skins in CS:GO and what's the Valve one, like Team Fortress and Fortnite and all this. Like the whole thing of loot boxes is another like, I don't think anybody would cry if we just banned the concept of loot boxes, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole.
People love to gamble. That's the problem here. And that's why you see a lot of these same features, whether it's on actual sports books or casinos or in video games or in mobile gaming apps or on social media. You know, these types of mechanisms that companies use to keep you on their app longer. And in the case of casinos, spending more money. But if you're not spending money, of course, you know, your time is, you're paying with your time. And yeah, gambling sells. So it's hard to escape that, especially on the internet.
All right, so we're coming up on time here soon. I want to ask the traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, and that is, what should people read if they want to learn more? What would you recommend? And this could really be anything. This could be other podcasts or YouTube videos that are great on this topic, everything we've been talking about here today. It could be books. It could be blog posts. It could be white papers, anything that you think that if someone's interested in the topic here, if they're interested in learning more about how sports gambling works or the policy around sports gambling, what would you recommend to those people?
So obviously, I got to give a shout out to my own blog, howgamblingworks.com, write about sort of how, obviously, how gambling works and some policy related stuff there. Also, I mentioned before, new book out by Jonathan Cohen called Losing Big, America's, I think, bad bet on sports betting. Really good, and sort of lays out, and he has a lot of articles as well, which you can read, which are sort of smaller versions of the book, and he lays out how this got legalized and sort of the process on a state by state basis, how this happened, where we got to where we were. Hopefully, we're going to be having some stuff on this at AIBM, the American Institute for Boys and Men, soon. We already have some overview of some of the research that you've mentioned as well. And then, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work by a lot of great people. I'll just give a shout out to work by Danny Funt, who writes a lot for the Washington Post, and David Hill, who recently had a great piece on sports gambling more generally in Rolling Stone. But yeah, there's a lot of good work being done there. And on the research side, hopefully soon will be the repository at AIBM for a lot of great stuff.
Well, I certainly hope that we see more from you guys at AIBM. I'm very interested in the work you guys are doing, and we'll be paying close attention to that. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this, because it's, you know, I like to gamble, and I've gambled for a long time, and that part of me and the libertarian side of me is also warring with kind of the policy nerd part that says there's some really bad stuff happening here. Like the outcomes are not going to be good. So I think more research is definitely needed so we can get a clearer picture of like what our options are and what would happen in different scenarios. So I hope you guys keep at it.
Yeah, I'll give one caveat there. Obviously, totally in favor of more research. I think more research not done by casinos and sports books or funded by casinos and sports books is an important part of that as well. There are a lot of great researchers and great work that have been affiliated with them, but I think it is really important to keep that line to make sure that everything is above board and they're not, you know, obviously people are not incentivized to bite the hand that feeds them. And so when it comes to research funding, it's really important that we get, you know, government support, other types of funding that doesn't come from the people who are making money off of people losing money gambling.
No, I agree with everything there. So I want to say thank you one more time to my guest today, Isaac Rose Berman. Isaac, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.